Hello and welcome. In the recent budget, we have seen that the government is now promoting the new tax regime over the old tax regime. For this, several changes have been proposed to the new tax regime in the budget 2023-24. For instance, the new tax regime is going to be made the default tax regime. That means if you want to choose old tax regime, then you have to specifically opt for it. Then standard deduction of 50k is being introduced even for new tax regime similar to the old tax regime. Then tax slabs have changed, eventually reducing effective rate of tax. Then there is reduction in rate of surcharge and so on. To know more about these changes, you may consider watching my earlier video, the link in the top right corner. So in today's video, let's talk about this new tax regime. First, let us understand the key differences between the new and the old tax regimes. Then we'll do the tax computation. Basically, we are going to do a comparison between the new and the old tax regimes for different levels of income starting from 5 lakh to 25 lakh. And in the end, we are going to see which one to choose in what situation. In the new tax regime, basic exemption limit is being increased to 3 lakh. If we compare this with the old tax regime, basic exemption limit is still at 2.5 lakh. But if you are a senior citizen, that is those who are of age 60 years or more up to 80 years, this basic exemption limit is 3 lakh. For super senior citizens, that is those who are 80 years of age or more than 80 years, this limit is going to be 5 lakh. But in today's video, we are going to consider only the first category, that is where the basic exemption limit is 2.5 lakh. Then in new tax regime, if your income is more than 3 lakh and if it is up to 6 lakh, then rate of tax is 5%. After that, for every additional taxable income of 3 lakh, tax rate is going to be incremented by 5% till you reach 15 lakh. Over 15 lakh, the rate of tax is going to remain at 30%. If you observe here, there is no 25% tax rate. Let's now compare this with the old tax regime. If your income is more than 2.5 lakh and if it is up to 5 lakh, rate of tax is 5%. More than 5 lakh up to 10 lakh, it is 20%. More than 10 lakh, rate of tax is 30%. Next criterion is the rebate. This is applicable to resident individuals. In new tax regime, you don't have to pay any tax if your taxable income is up to 7 lakh. If we compare this with the old tax regime, here the limit is only 5 lakh. 3. Standard deduction. After the recent change, standard deduction is being introduced even in new tax regime, which is going to be similar to the old tax regime. 4. Deductions and exemptions. If you choose new tax regime, you don't get certain exemptions and deductions. For instance, you cannot avail HRA exemption even if you stay in a rented house. You cannot avail deductions under section 80C to 80U. Basically, these are deductions like your PF contributions, your insurance premiums, NPS contributions, repayment of housing loan, then interest on loan to buy an electric vehicle, then interest on education loan and so on. You don't get these deductions if you choose new tax regime. Then no deduction of interest on housing loan in new tax regime. Then if you choose new tax regime, you cannot avail leave travel concession. Let's now compare this with the old tax regime. If you choose old tax regime, you can avail all these exemptions and deductions. Then there are certain exemptions on retirement benefits like leave encashment, gratuity, etc., which is going to continue in both new as well as the old tax regimes. If you would like to know more about these exemptions and deductions, you may consider watching the playlist. The link is in the top right corner. The playlist covers most of these deductions and exemptions. Before we jump into the tax computation part, let's see what do you have to do if you have to choose any of these tax regimes. There are 2 steps involved here. First step is applicable to salaried individuals. If you are a salaried individual, then in the beginning of the financial year, you need to let your employer know the tax regime that you intend to choose. This is required for the purpose of tax computation as well as for TDS. If you choose old tax regime, then in the beginning of the financial year, you need to make declaration to your employer, and in the end of the financial year, you need to provide proof of investments. This is for the purpose of final tax computation and for Form 16. But if you choose new tax regime, then there is no requirement of these declarations and proof of investments. Let's now move to the next step. This is required to be done before you file your income tax return, and this is going to be applicable to both salaried as well as self-employed individuals. If you have chosen new tax regime, then that is going to be the default tax regime, so you don't have to do anything except that you need to select this at the time of filing your income tax return. But if you have chosen old tax regime, then you need to specifically select this option before you file income tax return. For this, you are required to file form online. This is very similar to filing form 10IE. Form 10IE is filed as of now if you wish to choose new tax regime. But before you file this form, you need to remember two key things here. First, if you are a salaried individual, then you have an option to choose either of these two tax regimes every year, and you can keep switching between these two tax regimes. For example, one year you can select new tax regime, then next year you have option to choose old tax regime, then in subsequent years again you can switch back to new tax regime. No restrictions. But if you are a self-employed individual, that is, you have income from your business or profession, then once you choose old tax regime, it is going to continue even for subsequent years. Later on, if you want to choose new tax regime, you can do that. But once you do that, you cannot switch back to the old tax regime. And this restriction is going to continue until you have no business or professional income. So if you are a salaried individual, then there are no restrictions for you. But if you are a self-employed individual, then you need to remember this restriction. Let's now move to the tax computation part. Here basically we are going to compare the new as well as the old tax regimes for different levels of income. First, let's say your gross salary is 5.5 lakh. So standard deduction is 50k. This is going to be applicable in both new as well as old tax regimes. Let's say you have no other exemptions or deductions. So your taxable salary in new tax regime is 5 lakh, that is gross salary as reduced by standard deduction, and in old tax regime also this is going to be 5 lakh. Here you are not going to pay any income tax either in new tax regime or in the old tax regime because of the rebate. So from tax computation point of view, you can choose any of these tax regimes if your gross salary is 5.5 lakh. Let's now move to the second scenario where your gross salary is 7.5 lakh. Again, standard deduction is going to remain at 50k, no other exemptions or deductions. So your taxable salary in new tax regime is 7 lakh, and even in old tax regime this is going to be 7 lakh. Your income tax liability in new tax regime would be 0 because of rebate, but your tax liability in old tax regime would be 52,500. So here if you choose new tax regime, your tax saving would be 52,500. Third, when your gross salary is 10 lakh, standard deduction is going to remain the same. Let's say you avail HRA exemption of 1 lakh, that is you stay in a rented house, and other deductions are 1.5 lakh. Let's assume this is deduction under section 80C. So your taxable salary in new tax regime is 9.5 lakh, and that in the old tax regime it is 7 lakh, that is gross salary as reduced by standard deduction, HRA exemption and other deductions. So your tax liability in new tax regime is 52,500. This is going to be same even in old tax regime. So here also from income tax point of view, you can choose any tax regime. Moving on, we have gross salary of 12.5 lakh. Standard deduction and other exemptions and deductions are going to remain the same. So your taxable salary in new tax regime is 12 lakh and that in old tax regime is 9.5 lakh. Your tax liability in new tax regime is 90,000, and if we compare this with the old tax regime, it is going to be 1,02,500. So here if you choose new tax regime, your tax saving would be 12,500. Next, gross salary is 15 lakh. Standard deduction is same 50k. Here you have no HRA exemption, but your other deductions have gone up to 4 lakh. Let's say this would include ATC deduction of 1.5 lakh, then ATD or any other deduction of 50k. Then you have deduction of interest on housing loan 2 lakh. So taxable salary in new tax regime would be 14.5 lakh and that in old tax regime 10.5 lakh. Tax liability in new tax regime is 1.4 lakh and in old tax regime it is going to be 1,27,500. So if you choose old tax regime here, your tax saving would be 12,500. Next, 20 lakh. Standard deduction is going to remain the same, no HRA exemption. Let's say your other deductions have gone up by 5.5 lakh. That is, let's say you are availing deduction of interest on loan on purchase of electric vehicle. So taxable income in new tax regime is 19.5 lakh and that in the old tax regime is 14 lakh. Income tax liability in new tax regime is 2,85,000 and that in old tax regime would be 2,32,500. So here if you choose old tax regime, your tax saving would be 52,500. Last one, when your gross salary is 25 lakh. You have standard deduction 50k and let's assume you have no other exemptions or deductions. So your taxable salary in both new as well as old tax regimes would be 24.5 lakh. Tax liability in new tax regime is 4.35 lakh and that in old tax regime 5,47,500. Here if you choose new tax regime, then your tax saving would be 1,12,500. Here the income tax that is computed does not include higher education cess, which would be extra at 4% in both new as well as the old tax regimes. Let's now summarize this. If your gross salary is up to 7.5 lakh, then it is better to choose the new tax regime because of the rebate. If your gross salary is between 10 and 15 lakh and you avail basic exemptions like HRA when you stay in a rented place, then deductions under section 80C like your PF contribution and so on, then it is better to choose new tax regime because you would be paying lower taxes. But if your gross salary is more than 15 lakh and in addition to basic exemptions, you avail additional exemptions like LTC or additional deductions like deduction of interest on housing loan, then deduction under section 80D, that is the health insurance premium that you pay, then deduction under section 80EEB, that is interest on loan to buy an electric vehicle, and so on. If you have these additional exemptions and deductions, then only in that situation choosing old tax regime would be beneficial for you. To put it differently, if you do not have these additional exemptions and deductions, then it is better to choose the new tax regime. But if you are indifferent, that is, you can either choose new tax regime or old tax regime. Say for instance, scenario 1 and 3, you can choose any of the two tax regimes. In those scenarios, it is better to prefer new tax regime for two different reasons. One, because if you choose new tax regime, you don't have to file any form. Second, you will not be required to submit any proof of investments to your employer if you are a salaried individual. The tax computation, that is the comparison that we have just seen now, is going to be applicable only from financial year 2023-24 onwards. To put it differently, this is not going to be applicable for the current financial year, that is 2022-23. This is all I have for you. Hope the video was informative. Thank you for watching.